was said by Arnold Newman, who was a world-renowned photographer. Now, way before Joseph Nicephore made his first ever photograph in the world in 1860, there were hundreds of people who contributed towards the field of photography, including the medieval era scholar Ibn al-Haytham, who was hailed at UNESCO as the pioneer of modern optics. There have been scientists and a lot of people who contributed towards the industry's upbringing. But there was one community whose work had not really been appreciated. The research community who has smashed the patterns, searched the world around to bring about a new philosophy about the product. So today we are going to talk about a book, a well-researched book done by a Sri Lankan in terms of the development of an era of product. So he was born in Sri Lanka but has lived in the UK, US, and Malaysia. He read law at Cambridge University and practiced as a lawyer before entering the cultural sphere in 1998. She has been a collector of cultural objects for all her life, and she says has gradually exercised the discipline to make space for people she loves or the objects they collect. The Amarasinghe Ganendra collection is a generational collection starting with gifts from her grandfather and now added by her children. He was the first Sri Lankan specialist to be appointed to the Tate Gallery UK Acquisitions Committee and has served on numerous judging panels, including for the Commonwealth Arts Award and as a nominator for the Sovereign Art Prize and Aga Khan Architecture Award. So welcome, Shalini, with the book, as you can see, Veins of Influence. Welcome to The Voice Asian in its literary speaking.
Thank you very much, Danuka.
Shalini, so I know I read some details about you, but I always believe there's much more to people who write, and especially people who bring words to life. Could you please describe, on your own words, how would you like to be identified?
I would say that I'm an individual who's absolutely devoted to bringing beauty to life and bringing understanding through cultural objects and cultural bridges. That is an interdisciplinary exercise and of course speaks also to my educational background and my personal nomadic sort of lifestyle. So I must say now I'm pretty much stationed back and forth between two places, but there's a longing always for Sri Lanka, and that's why I focused on Sri Lanka throughout my cultural career.
All right. So when you say a nomad, is it in terms of digital nomad, like the newer generations?
No, not there yet. But that's the next project. It's in so far as my lifestyle. I've lived in a number of places, including working in a number of places, and of course the cultural exercise has taken me to many more places. And I found it as a wonderful entry and platform to understanding those spaces that I occupy, or at least opening the door, certainly not completely understanding, but opening the door to understanding.
Certainly, as well as I can see, you are a person of many talents. So let's begin the questions. This is the attempt is to bring your, to introduce veins of influence, what it is, and more details about you. So my first question is, could you provide an overview of the book Veins of Influence and what inspired you to delve into this topic of early photographs of colonial Sri Lanka? It's a very niche and a very interesting but different area.
Thank you, Danuka. It's fair to say that this book has been a lifetime in the making based on a lifetime of seeing. So photography has very much been a part of my life personally through personal collections of family as well as collecting art photographs. But I think photography occupies our spaces now more than ever with social media. So viscerally, photography is a medium that we identify with, and therefore it's very powerful. What got me thinking about this was looking, or the idea behind the impact of a photograph, apart from the academic writings, is just that very familiar, immediate impact a photograph has of, say, a family photograph when you look at it. So I started thinking about, well, what are the personal influences that go into the creation and the presentation and the collecting and the appreciation of those early photographs when the photograph was new. Now, you have mentioned correctly in your introduction that the idea of a photograph has been ongoing for long before its discovery in the 1830s with the daguerreotype. And it is this idea of the photograph and its impact that prompted me to research and develop veins of influence. Sri Lanka was perfect because the world at large really doesn't have as much early photographic knowledge of Sri Lanka as, say, the jewel in the crown, India. So we're all probably familiar with the photos of the Maharajas and the days of the Raj, at least have had glimpses into it. But Sri Lanka less so. And what had been done up to this point, very importantly, was classifying early colonial photographs of Sri Lanka and looking at photographers and how they approached it and how the wider colonial context was insofar as using these photographs. I wanted to move away from that and look at humanizing the photograph. And so the real impetus and the dynamic behind this book is the collecting of those photographs. I look at specific collections, which I was very fortunate to be able to find in the Royal Collection, in the Oxford and Cambridge universities, in the Royal Asiatic Collection, in Royal Kew, in the Rothschilds collections, that are collected by individuals who visited Sri Lanka and either photographed it themselves because they were able to, or collected and gathered photographs that were commercially available. So what was the collecting dynamic? How might they have shared those photographs? Is it different from that colonial construct that we look at normally? And I found that it was, because I looked at a number of materials that inform the collection. So really it became, I hope that the readers will see it as an exercise, Danuka, like showing a family album and having someone explain, oh, look, this is what's important to me. And this is what I did during my trip to Sri Lanka. And look, my diary notation, this is what I refer to, and this is what informs this photograph.
Right. Shall I personally believe that whether it's fiction or a non-fiction, when an author picks a name for the book, there is one very specific. There's always a reason that is either very personal or there is a direction. So why did you select this particular name, Veins of Influence? What was the reason behind it?
Veins of influence, veins of influence is the actual analytical construct that I use. And the reason I selected that name is because it's very much of a living concept. And not only is it organic in terms of just you think of the body and the blood veins, but you also think of the connections and the spreading of those connections. And that's how the veins of influence came into my mind. And in fact, in the early development of this idea, before I had even thought of a book, I spoke to a leading academic and I discussed the idea, and she said, go with it. This is fantastic. This has not been done before. So just fuel it and get the information. And of course, I didn't want to make it just an academic book. It's a scholarly book, but it's very accessible in terms of the read. And I'm sure you've read it, Danuka. So every single
Right.
word. But you will find that it's a really easy read. That's what I hope.
I mean, to be honest, it's also very thought provoking because this is not an area I was never, how would I say, a specialist on. But then made me read more on the history of photography and to realize there's much more to this whole industry. It was an amazing journey.
And it brings Sri Lanka to the forefront. It is about bringing Sri Lanka into the global discourse of photography and saying, look, there are these collectors and collections, both local and global. I should add, by the way, Julia Margaret Cameron is included. There are important Sri Lankan photographic collections, which are linked through the writings that I found in the UK archives. So, it's important. Sri Lanka takes a place even more in the global constructs, which is important. And we want there to be discussion on Sri Lanka.
I'm sure this is going to happen in time. So I'm going to move to the next question. So you seem to have a very fond memory of your childhood. You mentioned it, I think, in your intro itself, with with your childhood photography. So how did your family contribute or influence in this work?
And I think you'll also see that I dedicate the work to my mother,
Yes.
who passed on in 2018. Really, it's a very personal impetus because the image has been so influential in my own life as as a as an individual who has been displaced from an early age. Um, the photograph always brought me back to places that I felt rooted in. And so understanding those emotions and those connections to a photograph is what also fueled my interest, my early interest. Early in my career, I never thought that I would publish a book and that I would formally go down this route. But it was a passion that I was able to realize through that personal affection and connection to the photograph.
All right. So I think you talked very fondly about a photograph that was taken in New earlier with your grandmother at the very beginning. Was it like your introduction to your first thought on this?
Well, I wonder, in my mind, that memory is so clear, Danuka. And, and, and I know that there are things that are very real in that memory. And then I just wonder if they're not things that are created from looking at that photograph. So but it's an incredibly fun photograph because it's with my grandmother, who was an amazing woman. And um, it was a family trip, and it was a warm and wonderful sunny day. And all those emotional connections and visual ethoses just come together to create a brilliant feeling. And so, it's a sort of a fondness for and a connection to a motherland that I've carried throughout my life.
Well, we feel it even when you describe it that way. It's more very real. So I'm going to move to my next question. So correct me if I'm wrong. There are many genres and themes in photography. collections. That goes as social documentary, conservation photography, ethnographic photography, photo essays, new documents, social landscape. But all these come under one main common umbrella known as documentary photography. So what do you find in the range of influence? Which genre, which theme?
Okay. So I would say I think that we have to be very cautious about genres because a lot of the time they're arbitrary and their purpose is really to catalog either for library or academic or coursework or finding objects. So in insofar as my construct, I would say that it's very fluid, but there are really two genres. One is documentary and one is art photography. And often there's an overlap. And much of it depends on what the creator originally intended. For example, Julia Margaret Cameron, it was clearly art photography. Then we have people like Samuel Byrne or Skene. It was documentary, but presented in an artistic manner because they had a commercial audience that they wanted the buy-in for. So it's not so clear-cut, Tanuka, and I would say that this publication covers both the art photography and a collecting photography. So it's documentary in the sense those early photographs, individuals didn't have access to cameras per se, or they may not have. Um, and so they collected those photographs as we would collect postcards. But then later, the camera was introduced so they could take their own photographs. So it's a mixture of both.
Got it. The book features over 450 early photographs of colonial Sri Lanka from various collections. Can you tell us about the significance of these images, the context of Sri Lankan history and the colonial period, and what is the chronology of the collection?
The images date from the 1860s, the late 1860s, to the 1920s. So we're really talking about a period of about 50, 55 years. And most of the images are pre-19, pre 20th century. So very late 18th century, 19th century. The the images, there's a great variety. All of the individuals, as I said, visited Sri Lanka. And so their journey and their travels are reflected in the images that they've collected. So that's certainly one of the interesting points, how they collect. So we see the Prince of Wales, his absolutely beautiful album, meticulous and pristine, collecting in a different way. It may well be that someone else collected those images. He may have selected them himself. Very different from his son's album, the Dalton album, which really looks like a very personal and used album with 8 photos per page. You know, no spacing between the photograph. Whereas the Prince of Wales, it's one lovely photograph framed on a page, and then photographs that are found in frames that have been reproduced. So we see the variety across this book.
Right? I'm curious about one thing. I mean, now you captured almost 50 years of history until 1920s. So this is first three First World War. So I hope that there'll be some more work coming from you. I mean, to see the difference of the eras because uh, like post-war, where the technology developed and the world changed from what it used to be. I'm really curious what it would look like. So I hope there'll be another book like this one day to reveal that part. So I'm moving to my next question. The book discusses the role of collectors in shaping the narrative around image. Can you elaborate on how the collecting dynamic influenced the perception of understanding of these photographs?
The interesting aspect of the book is actually the collecting dynamic in many ways, because that's the novelty of the approach. And that's what makes these images personal. Because as I said, you can imagine sitting with the collector and having the collector explain his or her, or the creator, in the case of Julia Margaret Cameron, explaining his or her impetus in choosing or creating these images. And so how did I gather that information? It was through ancillary sources, diaries, publications written by the collectors or by others on the trip, for example, the Royal Collection. So it's a very I'm sorry, is the image not clear? Is it
Yes, there is a technical glitch.
right again? Okay, there we
Yeah,
go. Sorry about that. Okay, just to start again, the collecting dynamic was very, very critical, and it was informed by extraneous materials that, again, a vein of influence informed the photographs. So diaries, publications, news articles, notations in the images themselves, and sometimes it was, for example, in the German collection, publications by visitors to the German household that informed the collecting dynamic because they traveled through Sri Lanka together. So it was a wonderful treasure hunt. And some of the connections were serendipitous. So why the Sri Lankan collection was that in some of the royal collection materials, there was reference to certain Sri Lankans, and I happened to have access to those photographs from those families. So it was fantastic because yes, I started in my mind with those Sri Lankan images, but it really did connect back to this early photographic period.
that's wonderful. Shalini, now, if I'm not mistaken, a more major portion of the collections are from non-Sri Lankan sources.
Correct.
So on a thought-provoking question, I mean, I was just thinking, had these collectors been Sri Lanka, not not visitors, do you think they would have portrayed a vast different British Ceylon, and maybe our histories would have been written in a different manner because the photograph, the visuals talk about the world that we lived in and how each person can see it, perceive it completely different. How a British person who has the time of leisure to come and see a tea plucker, and how a Sri Lankan would see the same community will be completely different. What do you have to say about
I think your question really is very much about how we see the world that we occupy and what's important in it to us and what we wish to preserve. So, as an example from the publication, you'll see that the early photographs from the Sri Lankan collections are all portraits. It's all about legacy and the way that we would paint a portrait of ourselves or someone whom we hold dear. It's very much about legacy. So that was the construct, and in that sense, that was personal to those Sri Lankans who had those photographs. Of course, when we're visitors to a new place, we're going to collect differently. Now, Sri Lankans, if they were given a camera, what would they photograph? Would they photograph themselves? Probably. Isn't that the most interesting thing? Wow, I've got this toy, I can preserve an image and create an image of myself the way I want to be looked at for centuries to come. I mean, that's a pretty wonderful power. So would they photograph their houses, the way they live, parties, family occasions, celebrations, community gatherings? Would they focus on people versus archaeology or architecture? It depends completely on their level of interest. So we have a lot of writings by experts from the Royal Asiatic Society, for example, who are Sri Lankan. They would have probably photographed what expertise they wanted to focus on. Christians, missionaries, Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, all that. The world is our oyster. So it's our interest that we photograph. What's our objective in collecting and photographing?
I hear you. The question I asked, the reason was that people often use history for modern narrative, like create conflicts or to interpret history in a way that is very useful for them. So, but your point is very valid, and that's what it is. So, my next question is: in your book, you mentioned the collections of influencers. Could you share some insights into who these influencers were and how their collections reflect the cultural and historical context of Sri Lanka during that period?
I think I just I'll let me touch on a comment you made, which was very interesting. That history is a controlled narrative. The telling of history can often be a controlled narrative, and I think that the way we look at these images, it's always the case, and that's why it's very much it's critical to have different views. So we should be open to discussion and open to different views and disagreements, and ultimately the truth is it's all a matter of how much data you have for the argument that you are putting forward. So, and that changes over time as well. So if we appreciate that and we look at photographs also as being a part of that data gathering and that dynamic, then nothing is definitive. And looking at a collecting dynamic, again, this is a circumstantial narrative, but it's supported by, as I mentioned before, the diaries and the letters, and the books and the publications and so on and so forth, the newsprint. The individuals that I cover, just to name a few, because there are a number of them, are Rothschilds, Nathan Charles Rothschilds, who was a photographer himself and well known for being really the father of natural conservation in Britain. We have, of course, the royals and their royal visits, ranging from the Prince of Wales in the 1870s, his sons, Victor Alexander and George, and then George as an adult coming to Sri Lanka as before he became king, and Queen Mary's personal album. We have the Sri Lankan families, and I'm not going to mention their names so that you actually promote the book and get everyone looking at it. And we have Julia Margaret Cameron, who spent the last 4 years of her life. Her husband was absolutely besotted with Sri Lanka since he was an author of the Colbert Cameron Report, and he invested in tracts of land she came to Sri Lanka and she continued her photographic practice. And the images that she took of Sri Lanka, I argue, need to be understood in a different way. And again, there we have a very distinct difference from what has been written about those images previously. So, you see the history dynamic changing and a narrative or being added onto, the considerations being added on.
That's an interesting point, because, like you said, the data that you can collect and how much you bring into the picture to justify your narrative is important, and it keeps evolving. So, how do you think your book contributes to the global discourse of photography and visual application? What unique perspective does it bring to the
The veins of influence concept is a new concept. It is a practice, however, that is best practice when we put interdisciplinary research together, which is looking at other sources, and certainly in terms of curatorial practice, it is best practice. The approach of looking at early colonial photographs in a collective discourse like this, bringing collections together and looking at the collector's impetus and influence, to my knowledge, has not been done, certainly not with regard to Sri Lanka. So it was important, again, to do this, to bring these famous collections into the global discourse of photography and say, well, this is about Sri Lanka. And let's look at the importance of Sri Lanka and the way people interface with Sri Lanka in the early days. And these are the images that are part of our legacy as well.
As far as I can see, you're contributing in your own way to mark our presence in the world. This kind of work, like you said, it's the first of its kind. So the book includes images from both studio photograph and hobbies. So what difference or similarities do you observe in the intent and style of these photographs, the two groups of photographs?
That's a really good question, and I think that you will see most notably in the collection of the Rothschilds collection compared to the royal collections, that, well, first of all, you find the photographer sometimes in the photograph because someone else has taken that, or the collector in the photograph. And there is a uniqueness, of course, because when you have studio photographs, often there's repetition. Though interestingly, there wasn't much repetition between these collections. There were a couple of photographs that were repeated, but otherwise there wasn't, even with the studio photographs, much repetition. But there is immediately, of course, if it's a studio photograph, and by the way, when I say studio photograph, it's commercial studios. So what it would be, going to the photography studio and looking through a catalog of photographs under different segments: ethnology, archaeology, antiquity, landscapes, that sort of thing, and then picking out the photograph that you wanted and packing it all up and taking it back home. That's what I mean by studio photographs. And so that's going to necessarily have a different capture, because the photographer is thinking, what's going to be appealing to the buyer? How do I capture this photograph to make it a buying product? How do I make money off it? how does it promote my interest? Whereas, of course, a hobbyist, it's going to be more, oh, this is really interesting for me. I'm going to go out there and capture my experience. He has the license to do that.
So it's in between passion and commercial aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I would say both may be passionate, but
Yeah.
the hobbyist isn't looking to sell. He's not making a living off it.
And I'm pretty sure there's an impact on the photograph itself. When you
I think there is a difference. Certainly, even in physical format, the sizing is different. And then you have the different points still of photographs like Julia Margaret Cameron, which are staged photographs because they're portrait photographs that are staged, very staged. But then they are extremely creative, and she gets joy out of the creativeness. But she was an art photographer. She wanted to sell the photographs. Maybe not. Maybe these were for her personal consumption, but she was an art photographer.
I'm going to move to the next question. So, as a cultural entrepreneur and a scholar, how has your background and expertise informed your approach to curating and presenting the images?
The understanding and appreciation of the importance of interdisciplinary constructs and influences has been very much um, a guiding force in my cultural practice and my scholarly practice. So being able, over the some now nearly 30 years that I've been a cultural entrepreneur and an advisor, the projects that I have developed and brought to the fore have always focused on that interdisciplinary discourse. So ranging from, of course, exhibitions of all mediums to bringing in architecture and particularly sustainability constructs and novel sustainability constructs. They all help us to understand our world better and to understand and open the doors to other communities and other worlds. And we realize through that common dialogue and those bridges that it's really very interesting. And there's a lot worth knowing about other communities and a lot worth learning more about our own communities. So it's a lovely, lovely development of not knowing and then learning and realizing that we want to learn more.
Your work has focused on creative practices from under-recognized regions. How do these early photographs of Sri Lanka fit into the broader mission, and what cultural connections do they enable?
I think we've really the vein that has run through our conversation is about bringing Sri Lanka into the global discourse of photography, and that in itself, the fact that that is needed means that Sri Lanka has been under recognized, and that this is an example of such a dynamic and a step forward or a step into that discussion. And I think that we can always develop more around it. So if we look at these early photographs and this is Sri Lanka during a certain time, we can also look at other cultural objects from Sri Lanka that tell us more about our communities or the interface between colonial influences and our communities, and develop from there. I mean, we can look at the modernist movements, we can look at contemporary movements. This publication itself becomes a vein of influence in a longer narrative and a discussion that with discoveries yet to be made.
The book covers a wide range of collections, including those in the UK and local family collections. So can you share some of these challenges or discoveries you encountered while researching and accessing these collections? I think at the very beginning of the conversation you mentioned few, and if you have anything else to add here.
Okay. So the biggest challenge was the pandemic, because I was these images are not digitized. So I had to actually go into the archives, which was a wonderful experience in itself, but incredibly cumbersome during the pandemic time. So just to give you an example, and really the curators and the archivists whom I worked with welcomed me, and they were so professional and so wonderful. But going to the Royal Collection, for example, there were permissions, there were masks, there were, one person per room. And so those restrictions, I would say, were the most challenging. It just seems like a dream now, Danuka. It's done. It wasn't that bad. But at the time, it just, I think that it also made me more mindful, because it slowed me down. And that made me reflect and think and appreciate, because of the effort that had to go into these visits, making the most of those visits. So the challenge turned out to be a little bit more of a benefit, I would say, than being a negative. But that was the major challenge.
I personally believe the creative work done during this time of COVID has been exceptional. I mean, including ways of influence, because people really had time to
You're right. You're right.
life the world in a very different manner. So I'm pretty sure this is one of those magical work, because people really put their effort 100%, and overcoming these challenges was not easy at all. I mean, it was a different world altogether. So I'm moving to my next questions. We have three more, and so next one is you have been involved in various cultural and art related initiatives, including Gallery Week in Kuala Lumpur. How has your experience in these initiatives influenced the way you approach the project and its presentation?
Yeah, that really touches on something we've discussed before, which is the interdisciplinary, and really it's shaped. When I write, I also visualize how this material could be constructed as an exhibition for greater accessibility. And in fact, during the course of this writing, I did curate and present an exhibition at the Museum of Oxford, which further informed this writing, because there's a very synergistic process and an informing process when you do a different project that's related to another project. They inform each other. So in a nutshell, I would say that those interdisciplinary investigations, that architecture, paintings, exhibitions, workshops, artist residency, public talks on various subjects, advising the Tate, all of these inform the insights and the questions that should be asked, and which I feel I need to answer.
Could you also discuss the intersection of art and identity? As mentioned in your work, how do the image and the book relate to cultural objects as agents of them?
If you're the images have a variety of contents, Danuka. So if by cultural objects you include landscapes, archaeology. There's a lot of antiquity because H.C. Bell's collection is included. That was a real find. It's his early photographs of all the archaeological sites, and Bell, of course, is very well. He was the first archaeological commissioner. It was called the Archaeological Survey at the time. So those are cultural objects. In terms of objects as what you have behind you, there are none that come to memory. Interestingly, well, the exception to that is Julia Margaret Cameron's Portraits of the Ceylon Women, where I analyzed the jewelry that the women wear as points of identification for maybe their ethnicity or their background or the value of that jewelry in terms of their economic status.
Right. So next question is personally about yourself, because you're a person of many talents. So your involvement in the art world goes beyond writing. I think including commissioning green buildings and introducing artists to international audiences. How has your multifaceted approach impacted the cultural landscape in the regions that you have worked
Sorry, just to, are you asking me how my efforts have affected the regions that I've worked in?
Yeah, yes, that's
Okay. Well, I would certainly hope positively. And I think that over time, what has happened is these efforts have brought people together and created bridges. That's the most obvious consequence of many of these projects. So artists have been introduced to curators, and they've gone on to do projects. They've gone on to win awards, and then the second, I would say, most focused result would be that these regions have percolated into global conversations again. So the fact that even that the Tate invited me to sit on the acquisitions committee because of the Sri Lankan expertise and insights is an indication that there is more of a spotlight on these regions. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done. Beyond in a curatorial sense, and not just for commercial gain. I'm very focused on the curatorial and creating as an intellectual and a community discourse.
We're coming to the latter part of the session. So, can you share any memorable experiences or stories from your research, while working on this book, and that had some kind of profound impact on perspective of the book content?
Finding the connections and the veins of influence, really finding that it was such an incredibly suitable concept because these pictures came to life. One found that there were relationships. When you read it, you'll see there are relationships between one collector and another collector that's tied together through the writing. And then the images take on a different construct. So we see why the Sri Lankan images may be images of legacy because of the significance of these people in terms of a colonial appreciation for them, and that those were serendipitous moments as well as informing and confirming moments. There were lovely moments such as visiting the Rothschilds collections and looking at one album and then finding those images, well, not so exciting, and then the archivist calling me up 2 weeks later to say, we found another album and it has the most amazing photographs. You know, Nathan took more photographs, and that was just really exciting to look at those images. Interestingly, he didn't write about Sri Lanka, but that's an ongoing project. I'm going to see what we can find around the subject and how did he collect those images. So those are two more obvious consequences and constructs.
And in what ways do you hope the book will inspire the readers? I mean, whether they are specialists or collectors, general audience, to engage with this history and visual culture of colonial Sri Lanka.
I think that, Danuka, empire is such a hot topic right now. And what I hope is that this book will bring a humanizing approach, a kinder approach to the image through its collection, and bring that into consideration that ultimately we are always dealing with people. And we may not like them or we may like them, but that humanity is what I'm hoping to emphasize through this publication, to get us thinking when we look at anything or we consider any argument that there are other influences operating on us and on the people we're talking about that we should consider in the writing and narration of history in particular. And that responsibility is important because it affects what we do from here onwards. So we are participants in this continuing vein of influence narrative. And I would like the reader to appreciate his or her importance in that positioning. That we really have a responsibility when we engage with any cultural object to learn more about it.
That's true. I mean, it's time that colonial legacy, statues, all these have become hot topics and debates all around the world. And so I'm sure this brings light many areas that people can start to do sort of things. So I would like to ask, as the last part of our conversation, what's the future of Plains of Influence? What are you doing? Are you hoping to take it to another level? And as an expert on these subjects, what's your kind of advice for the Sri Lankan photographers or people who are in the research community? What do you like? What is the message? First, I would like to know what's the Plains of what are your
I have a number of projects that I'm currently working on. I'm a visiting fellow at Cambridge, and I am looking at more collections that apply the veins of influence narrative as well as slightly more legal constructs now. And so the journey continues, and what one finds, Danuka, is that one opens the door to a research topic, it leads to other research topics, and then it's a matter of, oh my gosh, let's rein this in and focus on what we need to accomplish in the immediate future. So I do have a few projects percolating. And insofar as just reminding what I would like for this book to influence is just thoughtfulness and reflection in terms of how we approach our craft and how we approach our viewing and our engagement with culture and creativity, realizing that we have a responsibility in terms of what we do to a greater community as well as to learnings that are ongoing.
And with your publisher are you hoping to bring it to new?
Yes, well, I must say Neptune has been a pleasure to work with, and they've produced a wonderful book. So that, it's a book that deserves to be on the global publishing stage, and they are bringing out an ebook. So should be that should be available certainly by end of November, early December, and that is a step towards a sustainability move. The book, the first edition, there's only going to be one edition at this stage. It's a total of 1,000 hard copy, which will of course be a very limited edition, and then 2,000 books.
So we'll have an e-version of Veins of Influence in November.
Yes,
We will
greener. It's greener, but not as fun to hold.
We will keep reminding our viewers and readers in November to look for the e-version of Veins of Influence. And today we spoke with Sri Lankan and exceptional personality, photography and research and art world. Shalini, it was a pleasure talking with you, and I learned a lot that I had no idea 4 days of my life about photography and how to see the world through it in a very different manner. So, and
but you asked a lot of very smart questions. Smart questions.
Thank you. And your book was a wonderful experience, to look at photography and the world in a different manner. So I wish you good luck and for your future work, and I hope you'll continue bringing spotlight to Sri Lanka and producing, like things like this for the global public and the Voice Asian and Asian Review readers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanuka, and thank you, the Asian Review. Thank you.
Thanks.